There's a photograph from 1838, the first photograph ever to capture a living human being. It's a street in Paris, Boulevard du Temple. 10 minutes of exposure time. The carriages and crowds blur into ghosts, moving too fast for the primitive camera to catch. The street looks empty, deserted, like a city abandoned. But if you look closely, bottom left corner, there's a figure, a man, standing perfectly still while someone shines his shoes, just standing there, motionless for 10 minutes. Long enough to be caught by history. Long enough to become real. Everyone else, the thousands of people who walked that street that morning, they're gone, erased by motion. But this one man, this random person getting his shoes shined, he remains, frozen. The first human face the camera ever learned to hold. That photograph was taken in the same decade that steam engines began pulling trains across continents. The same decade, the telegraph started sending words faster than horses could carry them. The same decade, factories began churning out more cloth in an hour than a handweaver could make in a month. The world was speeding up, and only the things that could stand perfectly still, the things that could wait for the light to burn them into the film, only those things would be remembered. Tonight, we arrive at the modern age. This is the era when everything accelerated, when steam turned to steel, when gaslight turned to electricity, when messages traveled at the speed of lightning and then at the speed of light itself, when humanity doubled, then doubled again, then doubled once more, when we learned to split the atom and photograph the Earth from space and hold the entire knowledge of our species in the palm of one hand. It's the era when we became modern. If this journey speaks to you, feel free to like and subscribe, and share where you're listening from in the comments. It's always remarkable to see how far these stories travel. Now take a slow breath. Settle in. Let the world outside fade like those blurred figures on Boulevard du Temple. Let's step into the age of revolutions, industry, science, and accelerating change. The age that built the world you're living in right now. The age we're still trying to understand, even as it keeps moving faster than any camera can catch. Change happened before, slowly. Villages became towns, towns became cities. Empires rose and fell across centuries. A farmer in 1200 lived much like a farmer in 1700. Same tools, same rhythms, same relationship to the land and the seasons. But something shifted in the 1700s. Something broke. And suddenly, within a single human lifetime, the world transformed more than it had in the previous 1,000 years. 3 industrial revolutions crashed over civilization like waves, each one faster and more violent than the last. First came steam and coal, turning muscle into machine, then oil and electricity, turning night into day. Then computers and networks, turning information into power. The nations that mastered these revolutions, that secured the coal, the oil, the steel, the rare earth metals, the data, those nations dominated the world. The nations that didn't fell under their shadow, colonized or consumed or simply left behind. This is the story of how we got here, how we went from candlelight to electric grids, from horse-drawn carriages to rockets, from letters taking weeks to messages arriving in milliseconds. How the same technologies that connected us also armed us. How the same innovations that created unprecedented wealth also enabled unprecedented destruction. Understanding the modern world means understanding this. Progress and catastrophe have always walked hand in hand. For thousands of years, human civilization was trapped. Population grew, food production grew, but never fast enough. Famine was always one bad harvest away. Poverty was the default state. Most people lived and died within a day's walk of where they were born. This was the Malthusian trap, the iron law of pre-industrial life. And then, in the late 1700s, we broke it. Steam power did what wind and water and muscle never could. It turned heat into motion, consistently, reliably, anywhere you could burn coal. James Watt didn't invent the steam engine, but in 1769 he perfected it, made it efficient, made it practical, made it inevitable. Suddenly, factories didn't need to be built beside rivers. They could be built anywhere coal could be delivered. And coal was everywhere in Britain, buried under Wales, under Yorkshire, under Durham. Black gold waiting to be dug up and burned. Textile production exploded. The spinning jenny let one worker do the work of 8. The power loom mechanized weaving. Cloth that once took months to produce by hand now poured out of factories by the mile. A few workers could now produce what had required hundreds of skilled artisans. The weavers saw what was coming. Some of them fought back. Between 1811 and 1816, textile workers across northern England rose up in the dead of night. They called themselves Luddites, followers of the mythical King Lud. They smashed the machines, burned the factories, left threatening letters signed with blood. They weren't stupid. They weren't afraid of progress. They were afraid of starvation, of being replaced, of becoming obsolete in their own country. The British government responded with soldiers and executions. The machines won. And the machines kept spreading. In 1830, the first passenger railway opened between Liverpool and Manchester. 30 miles in just over an hour. People thought it was witchcraft. They thought the human body couldn't survive speeds over 20 miles per hour, that the organs would liquefy, that passengers would suffocate. They were wrong. Within decades, railway networks stitched together entire nations. Iron rails carried coal to the factories and manufactured goods to the ports. Travel that had taken days now took hours. Markets that had been isolated became connected. For the first time, people and goods could move faster than a horse could gallop. Then came the telegraph in 1837. Instant communication across impossible distances. A message from London could reach Edinburgh in minutes instead of days. Business deals could be negotiated in real time. Prices could be coordinated. Armies could be commanded from a distance. The world was shrinking. Steamships finished the job. They freed ocean travel from the tyranny of wind patterns. Atlantic crossings dropped from 6 weeks to 10 days. The seas became highways. Britain, sitting on its island with its coal and its factories and its navy, became the center of a global web of trade. They called it the workshop of the world. Manchester produced textiles. Sheffield produced steel. Birmingham produced locomotives. Liverpool shipped it all overseas. And British merchant ships and warships controlled the sea lanes, ensuring that manufactured goods flowed out and raw materials flowed in. This was power. Economic power that became military power that became political power. Britain built the largest empire in human history, not through superior courage or divine right, but through superior steam engines and better access to coal. But steam power created something else, something unexpected, something dangerous. A new class of people who owned nothing but their labor, the working class. Unlike peasants scattered across villages, factory workers were concentrated in cities. They lived in the same slums. They worked the same brutal 12 to 16-hour shifts. They breathed the same coal smoke. They watched the same children disappear into the same machinery. And they began to realize they had more in common with each other than with the factory owners. Strikes spread. Unions formed. Governments panicked. Some intellectuals looked at the factories and recoiled. The Romantic movement, poets like Wordsworth and Byron, celebrated nature, emotion, individual freedom. They saw industrialization as a prison, mechanization as a cage. They wrote poems about daffodils and ancient ruins while the world burned coal and belched smoke. But the machines didn't care about poetry. The machines kept running. The Greek War of Independence, 1821 to 1829, was the first conflict where industrial naval power proved decisive. Greece had been under Ottoman rule for centuries. When Greek revolutionaries rose up, they were outgunned and outnumbered. But Britain and France intervened, not out of love for Greek freedom, but out of strategic calculation. At the Battle of Navarino in 1827, steam-powered British and French warships obliterated the Ottoman Egyptian fleet. Wooden sailing ships stood no chance against iron hulls and steam propulsion. The Greeks won their independence not because they were stronger, but because industrial powers decided the outcome. This was the future of war. Technology deciding battles, resources deciding wars. The Crimean War, 1853 to 1856, took it further. Steam-powered ships transported tens of thousands of troops to the Black Sea. Telegraph lines coordinated movements across hundreds of miles. For the first time, war correspondents could send dispatches from the battlefield to newspapers back home within days. The war was brutal, chaotic, incompetently managed. But it proved something important. Industrial nations could project power across continents. They could wage war on a scale that pre-industrial empires could never match. And that scale would only grow. The American Civil War from 1861 to 1865 became the first truly industrial war. It demonstrated steam-age technology's terrible potential when applied to military conflict. Railways enabled both sides to move troops and supplies over vast distances. Telegraph lines allowed real-time coordination across multiple theaters. The North's industrial superiority proved decisive. Its factories could produce rifles, artillery, and ammunition in quantities the agricultural South could not match. The war introduced innovations that would shape future conflicts. Ironclad warships made wooden navies obsolete. Rifled firearms increased battlefield casualties dramatically. Railway-based logistics enabled armies to operate far from their bases. The Siege of Vicksburg demonstrated how railroads could determine strategic outcomes. By controlling the railway junction, Union forces could cut the Confederacy in half. The war's enormous casualties exceeded 600,000 dead. This showed the deadly consequences of applying industrial production methods to warfare. Industrial capitalism transformed European society dramatically by the mid-19th century. It created unprecedented wealth alongside unprecedented poverty. Two German intellectuals developed a radical critique that would influence world history for the next century and beyond. Karl Marx, who lived from 1818 to 1883, was a philosopher and economist from the Rhineland who had witnessed the harsh conditions of early industrialization firsthand. Friedrich Engels, who lived from 1820 to 1895, was the son of a wealthy textile manufacturer who managed his family's factory in Manchester, England. This gave him first-hand knowledge of working-class suffering. These unlikely partners analyzed the revolutionary changes happening around them. They published the Communist Manifesto in February 1848, the same year that revolutions swept across Europe from February to December. Marx and Engels argued that all history was class struggle between oppressors and oppressed through ancient slavery, medieval feudalism, and modern capitalism. Industrial capitalism had created two fundamentally opposing classes. The bourgeoisie owned the means of production. Factories, machines, and raw materials needed to make goods. The proletariat owned nothing but their labor power and were forced to sell it to survive. The bourgeoisie extracted surplus value from workers' labor, keeping the profits that workers' efforts created while paying workers only enough wages to barely survive. This exploitation wasn't accidental, Marx argued, but was built into capitalism's very structure. Marx predicted that capitalism would eventually collapse, as its internal contradictions created a revolutionary working class. This working class would overthrow the bourgeoisie and establish a classless society. Let the ruling classes tremble at a communist revolution, they wrote. The proletarians have nothing to lose but their chains. They have a world to win. Marx also understood that capitalism required constant expansion. The need of a constantly expanding market chases the bourgeoisie over the globe. It must nestle everywhere, settle everywhere, establish connections everywhere. This insight proved prophetic. European powers embarked on unprecedented expansion into Africa, beginning in the 1870s, immediately after Marx published Das Kapital in 1867. Germany remained politically fragmented until 1871. However, regions like the Ruhr Valley developed heavy industry based on coal and iron ore deposits. The Zollverein Customs Union was established in 1834, creating a large free trade area. German states could benefit from industrial development even before political unification. This economic integration laid the foundation for eventual political unity. A unified German state would challenge British industrial supremacy. Railway development played a crucial role in German unification. Railway networks connected German cities and regions, facilitating trade and cultural exchange while enabling rapid military mobilization. When Otto von Bismarck orchestrated German unification through the Franco-Prussian War from 1870 to 1871, railways were essential. They enabled rapid movement of Prussian troops. French forces were defeated and the German Empire was established. France industrialized more slowly than Britain, but used technological capabilities to maintain its position as a great power. Railway construction connected Paris to major cities. Steam-powered textile mills in Alsace competed with British production. Napoleon III used railway construction strategically for both economic development and political control. This demonstrated how industrial technology could strengthen state power. France's participation in the Crimean War alongside Britain showed how industrial allies could coordinate military operations. Telegraph communications and steam-powered transportation enabled this coordination. French involvement in the Suez Canal project demonstrated French engineering capabilities. Engineer Ferdinand de Lesseps led the project, establishing French influence in the Middle East. In 1800, China's Qing dynasty controlled a vast empire with over 300 million people. It had deliberately isolated itself from European contact. Chinese society had complex economies, advanced technologies, and powerful military traditions. However, it had not experienced the Industrial Revolution, transforming European capabilities. The Opium Wars from 1839 to 1842 and 1856 to 1860 demonstrated steam power's overwhelming military superiority over traditional Asian armies. The wars began when China attempted to suppress the British opium trade, which had created widespread addiction and drained Chinese silver reserves. When Chinese officials destroyed opium shipments in Canton, Britain responded with military force, justifying the war as defense of free trade. British steam-powered gunboats could navigate Chinese rivers effectively, attacking coastal cities and withdrawing before Chinese forces could respond. Iron-hulled warships were virtually immune to Chinese artillery. Rifled firearms gave European infantry decisive advantages over Chinese troops with traditional weapons. Traditional Chinese war junks and coastal fortifications proved useless against industrial military technology. The Treaty of Nanking in 1842 imposed harsh terms on China. It forced China to open 5 treaty ports to British trade, ceded Hong Kong to Britain, and required payment of a massive indemnity. War indemnities financed further European industrial development while weakening the Chinese economy. This created a cycle where European technological advantages increased over time and resistance became increasingly futile. The Taiping Rebellion from 1850 to 1864 was influenced by European interventions disruption. The rebellion began in regions affected by the opium trade. It was partly inspired by Christian ideas introduced by European missionaries. Hong Xiuquan, the rebellion's leader, believed himself to be Jesus Christ's younger brother. He sought to establish a heavenly kingdom of great peace that would overthrow the Qing dynasty. The rebellion erupted in areas where European opium imports had created widespread addiction and severe social breakdown. European missionary activities had introduced new religious ideas that challenged traditional Chinese beliefs. The conflict killed over 20 million people and devastated southern China, including major commercial centers like Nanjing. The Qing government was forced to rely on regional armies and foreign assistance, further weakening central authority. This catastrophic experience reinforced Chinese desires for isolation from foreign influence. The Qing dynasty blamed European missionary activities and trade for inspiring the rebellion. They implemented policies restricting foreign access. The trauma of the Taiping Rebellion, combined with humiliating defeats in the Opium Wars, convinced Chinese leaders that engagement with the West brought only disaster. Isolationist tendencies would persist until the 20th century. Japan had maintained strict isolation under the Tokugawa shogunate since the 1630s. Foreign contact was forbidden, and the Japanese citizens were banned from traveling abroad. This policy, called sakoku, had created a unique civilization that developed independently for over 2 centuries. Society was rigidly hierarchical, with samurai warriors dominating farmers, artisans, and merchants. Japan had no knowledge of industrial developments transforming the Western world. The opening of Japan by American Commodore Matthew Perry in 1854 demonstrated steam power's ability to overcome centuries of isolation. When Perry's squadron entered Tokyo Bay in July 1853, Japanese coastal defenses proved completely inadequate. Perry's black ships were steam-powered warships that could move regardless of wind conditions. They shocked Japanese observers who recognized their traditional defenses were obsolete. Traditional cannon could not penetrate the iron hulls of American warships. Steam engines allowed Perry's ships to maneuver freely, regardless of wind and tide conditions. Japanese observers were particularly amazed that ships produced their own power through burning coal, creating the black smoke that gave them their nickname. Perry delivered a letter from President Millard Fillmore demanding that Japan open its ports to American trade and provide assistance to shipwrecked sailors. Perry departed, promising to return the following year for an answer. This gave Japanese leaders time to debate their response. They recognized that resistance was futile against such overwhelming technological superiority. When Perry returned in 1854 with an even larger fleet, Japan agreed to the Treaty of Kanagawa, opening 2 ports to American ships and establishing diplomatic relations. This forced opening shattered Japan's isolationist policy and convinced Japanese leaders that they must rapidly acquire Western technology or face the same fate as China. Unlike China, however, Japan would successfully modernize and become an industrial power, capable of challenging European dominance in Asia. The Meiji Restoration would soon follow. This would launch Japan's remarkable transformation from feudal society to industrial power. Meanwhile, the Ottoman Empire in 1800 controlled territories stretching from the Balkans to Arabia, including modern-day Turkey, Syria, Iraq, Palestine, and parts of North Africa. However, this vast empire was increasingly unable to compete with European powers' industrial and military capabilities. Internal rebellions, economic weakness, and technological backwardness created vulnerability. The Ottoman Empire became known as the sick man of Europe, vulnerable to both internal nationalism and external intervention. Muhammad Ali's Egypt from 1805 to 1849 represented the most successful attempt at indigenous modernization in the Middle East. This Albanian-born Ottoman governor used his position strategically, building a modern army equipped with European weapons. Textile mills powered by steam engines were established. A government monopoly over cotton production was created. His forces were trained by European advisors and equipped with modern firearms. They defeated traditional Ottoman armies and briefly threatened to conquer the entire empire. Muhammad Ali's success demonstrated that Middle Eastern societies could adopt industrial technologies effectively when given the opportunity. However, Muhammad Ali's modernization program ultimately failed because it depended on European technology and capital while challenging European interests. When his forces threatened to capture Constantinople, Britain and other European powers intervened to preserve the Ottoman Empire as a weak buffer state. This intervention established a crucial pattern where Middle Eastern attempts at independent modernization would be suppressed by European powers determined to maintain their technological and economic advantages. The Ottoman Empire's attempts at reform were known as the Tanzimat period, from 1839 to 1876. Railways, telegraphs, and modern administrative systems were introduced. The empire built its first railway line in 1856, connecting Constantinople to Edirne, with rail networks gradually extending to other major cities. However, these modernization efforts were financed by European loans, increasing Ottoman dependence on foreign creditors and ultimately contributing to the empire's financial and political weakness. The Suez Canal was completed in 1869, transforming the Middle East from a peripheral region into the crucial crossroads of global trade. This engineering marvel was built using steam-powered machinery and employed over 100,000 workers. The canal reduced the journey from Europe to Asia by thousands of miles. Control of the canal became a strategic obsession for European powers, with Britain particularly needing secure access to its Indian empire. The canal's construction demonstrated both the potential and problems of industrial development in the Middle East. French engineer Ferdinand de Lesseps led the project, but it was financed by European capital while Egyptian workers labored under brutal conditions. When the Egyptian government went bankrupt, partly due to the canal's costs, Britain took control of Egypt in 1882. This established a pattern of European domination over Middle Eastern resources and strategic locations that would persist well into the 20th century. The First Industrial Revolution established the fundamental pattern of the modern era. Technological innovation creates new forms of power. Nations compete to control the resources needed for technological development. Those who master new technologies gain decisive advantages over those who do not. The Steam Age showed that military and economic power increasingly depended on industrial capability. This set the stage for the more intense technological competition of the Second Industrial Revolution. The Second Industrial Revolution spanned from the 1870s to 1945. It witnessed an unprecedented acceleration of technological innovation that fundamentally transformed warfare, economics, and daily life. While the First Industrial Revolution had been based primarily on steam power and mechanical production, the Second Industrial Revolution introduced a complex array of new technologies. These included steel production, electrical power, chemical engineering, internal combustion engines, and petroleum-based energy. Steel production became the foundation of modern industry. The Bessemer process from 1856 and later the Siemens-Martin process enabled mass production of high-quality steel. Electrical power revolutionized production and daily life through Edison's and Tesla's competing systems in the 1880s. Chemical engineering enabled synthesis of artificial materials, with German companies leading in synthetic dyes, pharmaceuticals, and explosives. Internal combustion engines created automobiles in the 1880s, aircraft in 1903, and tanks. Mass production techniques, perfected by Ford around 1913, created the modern consumer economy. Germany's unification in 1871 created the most serious challenge to British industrial supremacy. Unlike Britain, which had developed gradually over decades, Germany could adopt the most advanced technologies immediately. German engineers studied British methods and improved upon them. The Ruhr Valley became Europe's most efficient steel-producing region. German chemical companies like BASF and Bayer led the world in synthetic materials. The Haber-Bosch process from 1909 epitomized German technological leadership. Fritz Haber and Karl Bosch developed a method for producing ammonia from nitrogen and hydrogen. This process enabled mass production of fertilizers, supporting larger populations. More ominously, it also provided raw materials for explosives. Germany could now produce unlimited quantities of ammunition, even when blockaded during wartime. German electrical companies like Siemens competed directly with American firms like General Electric. German universities trained more engineers than any other nation. By 1914, Germany had surpassed Britain in steel production and chemical manufacturing. This technological competition created the foundation for military rivalry that would explode into World War. The United States emerged as the world's largest industrial power during this period. Unlike European nations constrained by limited resources and markets, America had vast territory, abundant raw materials, and a rapidly growing population fed by massive immigration. Henry Ford revolutionized manufacturing with his assembly line methods, perfected around 1913. Faster and cheaper production meant that the Model T automobile dropped in price from $825 to $290 by 1925. Ford paid workers $5 per day, double the prevailing wage, to reduce turnover and create customers for his products. This created the template for modern consumer capitalism. John D. Rockefeller's Standard Oil Company controlled 90% of American oil refining by the 1890s. The company's vertical integration meant controlling production, refining, transportation, and retail sales. It became the model for modern corporations. As automobiles proliferated, oil became as strategically important as coal or steel. The war of currents between Edison's direct current and Tesla's alternating current systems was resolved by 1893 in favor of AC power. This enabled long-distance transmission of electricity. By 1920, American cities were fully electrified, transforming urban life and industrial production. American industrial capacity would prove decisive in both world wars. The United States could produce goods in quantities that European powers could not match, while remaining geographically secure from attack. World War I became the first conflict where industrial production capacity determined victory. The war began in August 1914 as a traditional clash between European alliances. It quickly evolved into a contest of industrial mobilization on an unprecedented scale. On the Western Front, machine guns produced in German and British factories created deadly killing fields. Artillery bombardments consumed shells in quantities that would have been impossible without mass production. The Battle of Verdun in 1916 saw French and German forces fire over 40 million shells at each other. Poison gas, manufactured in chemical plants, introduced a new dimension of horror. Britain's steel production peaked at over 10 million tons annually. Germany produced nearly 8 million tons despite naval blockade. The United States, entering in 1917, added 40 million tons of steel production. Entire economies were reorganized for war production. Women entered factories in massive numbers as men left for the front. Germany's advanced chemical industry provided early advantages. The Haber-Bosch process enabled Germany to produce explosives despite being cut off from Chilean nitrates by British blockade. However, Germany's chemical advantages were eventually overwhelmed by Allied industrial capacity. Aircraft evolved from experimental machines to essential military tools within 4 years. Tanks, combining internal combustion engines with steel armor, appeared in 1916. Radio communication enabled coordination between ground and air forces for the first time. The war demonstrated that victory in modern conflict required total mobilization of industrial resources. Traditional military virtues, courage, tactics, generalship, mattered less than steel production and chemical manufacturing capacity. The Russian Revolution of 1917 brought to power leaders committed to rapid industrialization through state planning. Vladimir Lenin and later Joseph Stalin sought to transform the predominantly agricultural Russian Empire into a modern industrial state. They wanted to compete with capitalist powers. Stalin's first 5-year plan launched in 1928 and attempted to compress decades of industrial development into a few years. Steel production increased from 4 million tons in 1928 to 18 million tons in 1940. Massive industrial complexes like Magnitogorsk were built from scratch, creating entire cities dedicated to steel production. This rapid industrialization came at enormous cost. The Holodomor of 1932 to 1933 was a man-made famine in Ukraine that killed 3 to 5 million people. Stalin's policies deliberately targeted Ukrainian farmers who resisted collectivization. Modern transportation and communication technologies enabled the Soviet state to control food distribution with unprecedented precision. This weaponized starvation. The Soviet model demonstrated how governments could mobilize industrial resources through central planning. However, the emphasis on quantity over quality led to massive waste and inefficiency. The human cost was staggering. Millions died in forced labor camps that provided workers for industrial projects. By 1941, the Soviet Union had become a major industrial power. This industrial base would prove crucial for survival during the German invasion of World War II. The discovery of oil in Persia in 1908 transformed the Middle East from a peripheral region into the center of global strategic competition. As internal combustion engines became essential for transportation and warfare, control of petroleum resources became a strategic obsession for industrial powers. The Anglo-Persian Oil Company, later BP, was established in 1909, giving Britain control over Iranian oil production. Winston Churchill's decision to convert the British fleet from coal to oil in 1912 made the Royal Navy faster and more efficient, but dependent on Middle Eastern resources. The collapse of the Ottoman Empire during World War I allowed European powers to gain control over oil-rich territories. The Balfour Declaration of 1917 promised British support for a Jewish homeland in Palestine. It simultaneously promised Arab independence. These contradictory commitments reflected British determination to control strategic resources. The construction of pipelines from Iraqi oil fields to Mediterranean ports involved complex engineering projects requiring steel, electrical equipment, and chemical processing capabilities. Control of these pipelines became as important as control of the oil fields themselves. The Armenian genocide of 1915 to 1916 saw Ottoman authorities use railways to systematically deport and murder 1 to 1.5 million Armenians. This genocide demonstrated how modern transportation and communication technologies could be used for mass murder on an unprecedented scale. World War II represented the ultimate test of industrial capacity during the Second Industrial Revolution. The conflict became a contest of production capabilities that dwarfed all previous wars. Germany's early success from 1939 to 1941 was based on superior technology and production efficiency. German tanks, aircraft, and artillery were often technically superior to their opponents. The Wehrmacht's rapid victories in Poland, France, and the early Soviet campaigns demonstrated how technological advantages could achieve decisive results. However, Germany lacked the industrial capacity to sustain a long war against the combined production capabilities of the United States, Soviet Union, and British Empire. American factories produced 300,000 aircraft, 100,000 tanks, and 87,000 ships during the war. Soviet factories, many relocated beyond German reach, produced 84,000 tanks and 125,000 aircraft. Nazi Germany applied industrial methods to genocide with systematic efficiency from 1941 to 1945. Railways transported victims across Europe. Chemical companies produced Zyklon B gas for death camps. Industrial management techniques organized the murder of 6 million Jews and millions of other victims. This represented the darkest application of Second Industrial Revolution technologies. The development of long-range bombers enabled attacks on enemy industrial capacity. The bombing campaigns against German and Japanese cities demonstrated how industrial warfare could target civilian populations. The firebombing of Dresden and Tokyo killed hundreds of thousands of civilians. The Manhattan Project demonstrated the ultimate potential of industrial mobilization. Over 130,000 workers and $2 billion created weapons that could destroy entire cities. The atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945 showed that technology had gained the power to threaten human civilization itself. Japan's transformation from feudal society to industrial power represented one of the most remarkable modernization efforts in history. The Meiji Restoration of 1868 brought leaders committed to acquiring Western technology. They wanted to maintain Japanese independence. Steel and shipbuilding industries became the foundation of Japanese power. By 1900, Japan was producing modern warships that could compete with European designs. Victory in the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905 demonstrated that Asian powers could master European military technologies. Japanese success led to aggressive expansion in Asia. The invasion of Manchuria in 1931 and China in 1937 demonstrated Japanese industrial and military capabilities. However, Japan lacked the natural resources needed for sustained industrial warfare against powers like the United States. Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor brought the United States fully into World War II. Despite early successes, Japan could not match American industrial production. The United States produced more aircraft in 1944 than Japan had produced in its entire history. Japan's defeat demonstrated the decisive importance of industrial capacity in modern warfare. The Second Industrial Revolution established the fundamental pattern of the modern era. Nations that could master new technologies and mobilize industrial resources effectively gained decisive advantages over those that could not. The period demonstrated both the creative and destructive potential of rapid technological development. Chemical engineering could produce fertilizers to feed millions or poison gas to kill thousands. Steel production could build hospitals or battleships. Electrical power could illuminate cities or coordinate genocide. The internal combustion engine could power ambulances or tanks. The choice between creation and destruction lay not in the technology itself, but in how societies chose to use their industrial capabilities. By 1945, nuclear weapons had given humanity the power to destroy civilization itself. The Second Industrial Revolution had created technologies that would define the remainder of the modern era. It demonstrated that technological advancement alone could not guarantee human progress or moral development. The Information Age emerged from the ashes of World War II, ushering in an era where humanity would learn to manipulate information itself as a form of power. While the steam engine had amplified our muscles and electricity had extended our reach, this new revolution went straight for the human mind. For the first time in history, we began building machines that could think, calculate, and communicate faster than any human brain. This wasn't just another industrial revolution, it was something fundamentally different. Previous revolutions had given us stronger arms and faster legs through machinery. The Information Age gave us enhanced minds and the ability to connect every human consciousness into a vast, pulsing network of instant communication. Suddenly, a farmer in Iowa could speak to a businessman in Tokyo as easily as talking to his neighbor. Knowledge that once took months to cross oceans now traveled at the speed of light. Nuclear technology introduced both unprecedented destructive capability and revolutionary energy production. The development of hydrogen bombs created weapons thousands of times more powerful than those used in World War II. Nuclear power plants promised clean, abundant energy. The nuclear age fundamentally altered international relations by making direct warfare between major powers potentially suicidal. Computer technology evolved from room-sized machines used for scientific calculations to personal devices that connected individuals to global information networks. The development of transistors at Bell Labs in 1947, integrated circuits in 1958, and microprocessors enabled exponential increases in computing power. This dramatically reduced costs and size. Space technology demonstrated human capability to escape Earth's gravity and explore other worlds while creating new platforms for communication, navigation, and military surveillance. The Soviet launch of Sputnik in 1957 shocked the world and began the space race. Internet and global communications created the first truly global information network. The World Wide Web, developed by Tim Berners-Lee in 1989, transformed the Internet from a tool for scientists and military personnel. It became a universal platform for commerce, education, and social interaction. Biotechnology and genetic engineering have opened possibilities for manipulating the fundamental processes of life. Artificial intelligence and automation are replicating and surpassing human capabilities in specific areas like game playing, pattern recognition, and data analysis. World War II ended with the United States and Soviet Union standing as the only superpowers, each armed with nuclear weapons and opposing visions for humanity's future. Both nations understood a simple truth: whoever controlled the next generation of technology would dominate the world. What followed was the strangest war in human history. American and Soviet scientists raced to unlock the universe's secrets, pouring billions into research laboratories and think tanks. Every breakthrough, whether in rockets, computers, or weapons, could tip the global balance of power. This wasn't just a competition, it was a desperate sprint where second place might mean annihilation. The Cold War from 1945 to 1991 created a paradox that haunted humanity for nearly half a century. The same nuclear weapons that prevented World War III also meant that any mistake, any miscalculation, could end civilization in minutes. This fundamentally new form of international conflict saw direct military confrontation between major powers prevented by nuclear deterrence, while competition continued through proxy wars, technological races, and ideological struggle. At its peak, the global nuclear arsenal contained over 70,000 warheads, with combined destructive power equivalent to over 1 million Hiroshima bombs. Every day, people woke up knowing that somewhere, someone had their finger on a button that could destroy the world. The Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962 demonstrated how quickly technological capabilities could create situations where human survival depended on the decisions of a few political leaders. Soviet medium-range ballistic missiles in Cuba could have reached American cities within minutes, while American missiles in Turkey threatened Soviet territory. The crisis was resolved through diplomatic negotiations, but it showed how information-age technologies had created unprecedented dangers alongside their benefits. The space race became a crucial arena of superpower competition that drove rapid development of rocket technology, computer systems, and materials science. The Soviet Union's launch of Sputnik in 1957 shocked American leaders who had assumed their technological superiority. The American moon landing in 1969 demonstrated the capability to achieve seemingly impossible technological goals through massive resource mobilization. Computer development was accelerated by military needs for calculating ballistic trajectories, processing intelligence data, and controlling nuclear weapons systems. The ENIAC computer, completed in 1946, required an entire room and consumed as much electricity as a small town. But it could perform calculations in hours that would have taken human mathematicians years to complete. Satellite technology created new capabilities for global communication, navigation, and surveillance. The first communication satellite, Telstar, enabled live television broadcasts between Europe and North America in 1962. This demonstrated the potential for global information networks. Military satellites provided reconnaissance capabilities that enabled superpowers to monitor each other's activities while reducing the risk of surprise attacks. Proxy wars in Korea from 1950 to 1953 and Vietnam from 1955 to 1975 demonstrated how information-age technologies affected regional conflicts. The Korean War introduced jet-powered fighter aircraft that could fly at speeds approaching the sound barrier, while helicopter technology enabled rapid movement of troops and supplies in mountainous terrain. Despite overwhelming advantages in aircraft, artillery, and naval power, United Nations forces were unable to achieve decisive victory against Chinese and North Korean forces. The Vietnam War showed how advanced technology could be countered by determined opponents using guerrilla tactics adapted to local conditions. American forces possessed helicopters, napalm, Agent Orange defoliants, and sophisticated electronic surveillance equipment. But they were unable to defeat North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces, who used tunnel networks, booby traps, and intimate knowledge of local terrain. The Middle East's strategic importance increased dramatically during the Information Age as petroleum became essential for transportation, chemical production, and electrical generation. The creation of Israel in 1948 introduced a new source of conflict as Palestinian Arabs were displaced from their homeland. The discovery of vast oil reserves in the Persian Gulf made the region crucial to global economic stability. The region became a focal point of Cold War competition as both superpowers sought to influence oil-producing nations and establish military bases in strategically important locations. Local conflicts became proxy wars between superpowers, while Middle Eastern nations attempted to use superpower rivalry to advance their own interests. Arab-Israeli wars in 1948, 1967, and 1973 demonstrated how information age technologies transformed Middle Eastern warfare while creating new forms of regional instability. The Six-Day War of 1967 showed the decisive impact of air power when Israeli forces destroyed Arab air forces on the ground. This achieved complete air superiority that enabled rapid conquest of the West Bank, Gaza Strip, Sinai Peninsula, and Golan Heights. The Yom Kippur War of 1973 introduced precision-guided anti-tank and anti-aircraft missiles that challenged the dominance of tanks and aircraft that had characterized earlier conflicts. Egyptian forces used Soviet-supplied surface-to-air missiles to neutralize Israeli air superiority, while anti-tank missiles enabled infantry to destroy heavily armored vehicles. These technological developments showed how defensive weapons could offset the advantages of expensive offensive systems. The oil crises of 1973 and 1979 demonstrated how control of energy resources could be used as a political weapon in the age of petroleum-dependent economies. Arab oil-producing nations used production cuts and price increases to pressure Western nations supporting Israel, causing gasoline shortages and economic recession in industrialized countries. The oil crisis accelerated development of alternative energy technologies and energy conservation measures while demonstrating the vulnerability of petroleum-dependent societies. The Iranian Revolution of 1979 showed how information-age communication technologies could enable rapid political mobilization while creating new forms of international conflict. Cassette recordings of Ayatollah Khomeini's speeches were smuggled into Iran and distributed through mosque networks, enabling coordination of opposition to the Shah's government. The revolution created an Islamic republic that challenged both superpower spheres of influence while demonstrating how religious movements could use modern technology for political organization. The Iran-Iraq War from 1980 to 1988 became a devastating conflict that killed over 1 million people. It demonstrated the destructive potential of modern chemical weapons and missile technology. Iraqi forces used chemical weapons against Iranian troops and Kurdish civilians. Both sides attacked oil facilities and civilian targets with ballistic missiles. African nations gained independence during the height of the Cold War, inheriting colonial boundaries that often divided ethnic groups while forcing traditional enemies into the same political units. The new nations possessed abundant natural resources, but lacked the industrial infrastructure, educational systems, and political institutions needed for economic development in the technological age. Both superpowers competed for influence in Africa by supporting friendly governments, providing military aid, and financing development projects. However, Cold War competition often exacerbated existing conflicts while creating new sources of instability as local disputes became proxy wars between global powers. Decolonization movements used information-age communication technologies to coordinate resistance to colonial rule and mobilize international support. Radio broadcasts, telephone networks, and eventually television coverage brought global attention to independence struggles, while enabling coordination between nationalist movements across the continent. Kwame Nkrumah, who lived from 1909 to 1972, led Ghana to become the first African colony to gain independence in 1957, inspiring liberation movements. Nkrumah used radio broadcasts to communicate with rural populations and coordinate political activities, while international media coverage of Ghanaian independence encouraged similar movements throughout Africa. Julius Nyerere, who lived from 1922 to 1999, guided Tanzania's independence and promoted African socialism as an alternative to both capitalist and communist models. Nyerere's policies emphasized rural development and self-reliance, but Tanzania struggled to achieve economic growth in an increasingly technological global economy. Nelson Mandela, who lived from 1918 to 2013, spent 27 years in prison fighting South African apartheid before becoming his country's first black president in 1994. The anti-apartheid movement used international media coverage, economic sanctions, and diplomatic pressure to isolate the South African government. This demonstrated how global communication networks could support human rights campaigns. Resource extraction industries dominated many African economies, but failed to generate broad-based development. Mining operations used advanced technology to extract copper, diamonds, gold, and other minerals. But most profits flowed to foreign companies while local populations remained impoverished. Communication technologies enabled African nations to leapfrog some stages of infrastructure development. Mobile telephone networks expanded rapidly across Africa in the 1990s and 2000s. This provided communication capabilities in areas that had never had landline telephone service. Conflict and civil wars were often fueled by competition for natural resources, while being fought with weapons that reflected information-age military technology. The Rwandan genocide of 1994 killed approximately 800,000 people in 100 days. Much of the killing was coordinated through radio broadcasts that incited ethnic hatred while directing violent actions. In 1949, Mao Zedong proclaimed the People's Republic of China from the gates of the Forbidden City, sealing off the world's most populous nation from global markets. China would spend the next 3 decades pursuing a revolutionary dream that turned into a nightmare. The Great Leap Forward promised to vault China from feudalism to communism overnight. Instead, it created one of history's worst famines, killing tens of millions. The Cultural Revolution sought to purify Chinese society, but instead destroyed a generation's education and cultural heritage. Yet from this catastrophe emerged a remarkable transformation. When Deng Xiaoping took power in 1978, he understood what Mao had refused to see. China couldn't develop in isolation. "It doesn't matter if a cat is black or white," Deng famously said, "as long as it catches mice." With this pragmatic philosophy, he cracked open China's doors to the world while keeping the Communist Party's grip on power. What happened next stunned everyone. Foreign companies rushed into special economic zones drawn by China's massive workforce. Farmers' daughters who had never seen a factory became assembly line workers building iPhones. Fishing villages transformed into megacities seemingly overnight. Within a single generation, China went from bicycles to bullet trains, from isolation to becoming the world's factory. But China wasn't content to merely assemble other nations' products. Chinese companies like Huawei and Alibaba rose from nothing to challenge Silicon Valley giants. When China sent its first astronaut into space in 2003, it announced to the world that the Middle Kingdom was back. And this time, it intended to lead. The Belt and Road Initiative reveals China's ultimate ambition: By building ports, railways, and digital networks across 3 continents, China is constructing a new world economy with Beijing at its center. This isn't just about money or power, it's about proving that after 2 centuries of humiliation, China has reclaimed its place as a great civilization. The question now isn't whether China will shape the 21st century, but how. When the Berlin Wall fell in 1989 and the Soviet Union collapsed 2 years later, the world breathed a collective sigh of relief. The Cold War was over. Surely now humanity could focus on progress rather than destruction. But instead of ending competition, the digital revolution simply changed the battlefield. The World Wide Web, born in a Swiss physics lab, would soon connect billions of minds in ways no one could have imagined. Suddenly, a company could design products in California, source materials from Africa, manufacture in China, and sell everywhere simultaneously. Container ships became conveyor belts crossing oceans, while satellites coordinated this vast dance of global commerce. A toy ordered in London on Monday could be assembled in Shenzhen on Tuesday and delivered by Thursday. National borders became increasingly meaningless as money, ideas, and goods flowed like water finding its level. But this interconnected world proved fragile in unexpected ways. When American banks collapsed in 2008, the shockwaves toppled economies from Iceland to Indonesia within days. A computer virus released in one country could paralyze hospitals, power grids, and governments worldwide. The same networks that spread prosperity also transmitted chaos at the speed of light. Social media promised to democratize information and empower the voiceless. The Arab Spring of 2011 seemed to prove this promise. Protesters in Tunisia, Egypt, and Libya used Facebook and Twitter to topple dictators who had ruled for decades. But the digital tools that could organize a revolution couldn't build a democracy. Most Arab Spring nations descended into chaos or returned to authoritarian rule. This taught a harsh lesson about technology's limits. Cybersecurity became the new frontier of international competition. Nations poured billions into both defensive systems and offensive capabilities, recognizing that future conflicts might be won or lost in cyberspace. A successful cyber attack could cripple a nation's infrastructure more effectively than traditional bombing. The same interconnected systems that powered the global economy had become its greatest vulnerability. Now we stand at the threshold of the 4th Industrial Revolution. Artificial intelligence isn't just matching human capabilities, it's exceeding them. AI systems diagnose cancer better than experienced doctors, write legal briefs faster than lawyers, and predict market movements more accurately than veteran traders. Every month brings breakthroughs that seemed impossible the year before. We're not just building better tools anymore. We're creating minds that may soon surpass our own. We are living through humanity's most thrilling chapter. The same species that once huddled around fires in caves now sends messages across the globe at the speed of light. The descendants of people who died from simple infections now edit the very code of life itself. We stand at the threshold of the 4th Industrial Revolution, and what comes next will make everything before look like prehistory. Think about what's already happening. AI systems peer at medical scans and spot cancers that the best doctors miss. They sift through mountains of data and find patterns that unlock new medicines, new materials, and new possibilities. In laboratories around the world, machines that can learn are beginning to solve puzzles that have stumped humanity for centuries. And this is just the beginning. The tools we've built are becoming extensions of our minds. A construction worker with an augmented reality headset sees through walls. A surgeon operating with robotic assistance performs operations that human hands alone could never manage. We're not replacing humans. We're becoming something more than human. Remember the scale of what we've achieved. Your smartphone has more computing power than all of NASA had when they put humans on the moon. The entire repository of human knowledge sits in your pocket. You can learn from the greatest teachers, access the finest art, and connect with brilliant minds anywhere on Earth. Leonardo da Vinci would have created miracles with such tools. Einstein would have unlocked even deeper mysteries. The most exciting part is that we're just getting started. Quantum computers are beginning to crack codes that would take traditional computers millions of years to solve. Gene editing tools are turning biology into a programming language we can rewrite. Private companies are building rockets to make humanity a species that lives among the stars. Each breakthrough enables 10 more. Each discovery opens doors we didn't even know existed. Yes, we face challenges, disease, poverty, the limits of our resources. But look at our track record. We turned sand into computer chips, we made metal fly, we split the atom and decoded the genome. The same ingenuity that created these miracles is now armed with tools 1,000 times more powerful. This isn't blind optimism, it's pattern recognition. Every generation has believed they lived at the pinnacle of human achievement, and every generation has been wrong. The farmers who first planted seeds couldn't imagine cities. The builders of the first steam engines couldn't imagine the internet. And we, even with all our knowledge, can barely glimpse what our children will create. We are the bridge generation, the ones who will hand tomorrow's builders tools that transform humanity itself. The choices we make now will echo for millennia. We can choose fear and build walls, or we can choose courage and build wonders. The future isn't just coming, we're building it, line of code by line of code, discovery by discovery, dream by dream. And if the past is any guide, it will be more magnificent than our wildest imagination can conceive. The best is yet to come.